Hello, class. Welcome. It's me, Mr. Denny, your U.S. history teacher. That's so loud. Today, we're going to be talking about the election of the year 2000. Year 2000. It sounds like the future, and yet it's the past. Specifically, the election here is between George Bush and Al Gore, and there's even a Supreme Court case that actually decides the election. Hopefully you have your lecture notes. I've got mine on my phone here. Remember, make a copy if you want to type one yourself or, print it out, whatever is your preference. Let's make this full screen. Let's use technology. There we go. So, it's the election of 2000, the election between Al Gore and George Bush. Our objective, our goal here by the end of this lesson is to be able to analyze the factors affecting the outcome of the 2000 election. So ultimately, in other words, why does it end the way it ends? Well, let's continue. Let's look at who our candidates are. So as you'll remember from our last lecture, when we talked about the LA riots, Bill Clinton is the president. He wins that election in 1992. He's a two-term president all the way up to the year 2000. Bill Clinton, he was facing a lot of trouble, specifically because he was impeached. And Al Gore, his vice president, was able to distance himself, and he becomes the Democratic candidate for president, right? So Al Gore, this guy right here, he's the Democratic candidate. And then on the Republican side, we have George W. Bush, who we see here and here. He is the son of former President George Bush. So his dad is George Bush. This is George W. Bush. George W. Bush is able to win the Republican nomination. And fun fact here, right? So his dad was the president before, and his brother, Jeb Bush, was the governor of Florida at this time. Keep that little fact in mind. So those are our candidates here that we're working with. And before we jump to the election, let's talk very quickly about how presidential elections work. So presidents are not chosen by who gets the most votes, right? That actual final who gets the most votes or the popular vote, that doesn't matter, right? So popular vote is, well, it matters. But popular vote is strictly just like the total number of people voting for each candidate, right? Instead, presidents are ultimately chosen by what's called the electoral vote, right? An electoral vote is, let's say, a certain number of people vote for one candidate in a state. That candidate's electors, or like assigned people, they're the ones who cast that vote, right? An elector is, it's the number of people assigned to each state. Every state has a different number, right? So the bigger the population, the more electors it's worth, and it's getting all those electors, that electoral vote, that's what actually decides a presidency. So in total, there are 538 electoral votes that someone can get. And so the first candidate who wins more than half of that, which would be 270, wins the presidency, right? You'll learn all about this when you take government, but that's like a very quick, brief run through. There's the popular vote, and that's like the total number of people. And then there's the electors, which is like winning certain states, and each state is worth a different amount of electoral votes, or like points, if you want to think of it as a game. So presidential elections, right? So you have to get to 270 to win the presidency. And here's a good example of the difference there. So on the left would be the popular vote. So you can see like in each little category, right? In each little category, like in this one, there's more blue than red. In this one, there happens to be more red than blue. In this one, like going horizontally across, there's more blue than red, right? So if we were to tally up the blue and red for popular votes, there would be more blues. But if we do it based on who wins each little segment, each little group, right? So blue wins this group, red wins that group, and each little group is worth a certain number of points. Could be that the red dots win an election, right? Two different ways of determining it, and here electoral votes is what decides the presidency. Let's continue. So election day in the year 2000, Al Gore wins the popular vote, right? right? He wins the popular vote. Raw numbers, he wins the popular vote by over 500,000 votes. However, Al Gore ends up only getting 255 electoral votes. George Bush, the Republican candidate, gets 246. And you need 270 electoral votes to win the presidency, right? So there were some close calls in Oregon, there were some close calls in Mexico, but ultimately the election here depends on Florida. Florida, even though it doesn't seem that much bigger than these other states, Florida is worth 25 electoral votes. You win Florida, you win the election, you win the presidency, right? So the election depends on Florida. Couple issues, though, in the state of Florida. So, Florida begins... These are weirdly out of order. There we go. So, 10 minutes before the polls close in Florida, television networks started declaring that Al Gore had won Florida. They were polling people as they left the polls, and people were like, I voted for Al Gore. And so the news networks were tallying these up, and they announced 10 minutes before the polls closed, Al Gore has won Florida. And right, and if you win Florida, you win the presidency. 2 hours later, the news then begins to place Florida back into the undecided column, because as they started counting the votes, turns out George Bush was taking the lead, right? So first it was Al Gore, now it's George Bush. They keep counting the votes. By 4:30 a.m., Al Gore had narrowed that lead to just 2,000 votes, right? Just 2,000 votes are separating who's the president and who isn't the president, right? And in the end, here, during this recount, Bush was declared the winner by 537 votes. That's nothing. That's like less than the population at our school, right? And because it's so close, by law, automatically, we got to do a recount. We got to do a recount, make sure it's close. And let's actually take a look at these news networks. If I can get it to exit. Let's take a look at these news networks as they call the election, right? It's almost comical, right?
A big call to make. CNN announces that we call Florida in the Al Gore column. This is a state both campaigns desperately wanted to win.
Stand by. CNN right now is moving our earlier declaration of Florida back to the too close to call column.
Too close to
25
call.
very big electoral votes in the home state of the governor's brother, Jeb Bush, are hanging in the balance. This no longer is a victory for Vice President Gore. George Bush, governor of Texas, will become the 43rd president of the United States at 18 minutes past 2 o'clock Eastern time.
So we'll pause that. Look, 2:18 a.m., right? The news network is like flip-flopping. They're like, we called it too early. And so because that vote is so close, coming in weird again, because that vote is so close, automatically, by law, there's a recount. Well, if you're George Bush, you're like, what? No recount. I won. Clearly I won. Let's just keep going with the whole presidency thing. And there are also a couple actual, issues with the votes, with the ballots themselves. So Florida was using paper ballots. So on paper, you'd use like a little machine, or you'd use like a little thing that looked like a pen, kind of. I was looking around to see if I had a pen. How do they not have a pen? Here's a headphone cord, right? So you would like use your pen to like punch out the dots on the candidate that you would want to win. And this would result in the little paper dot. Like sometimes it would be out, sometimes it wasn't punched all the way through, sometimes there was a hanging little piece of paper, what they called a chad. By the way, that's going to be our secret word, is chad. All caps, lowercase, but chad is the secret word. But sometimes a little piece of paper would just be hanging, and they were like, does that count for them? Does that not count? And, over time, you're counting these votes up until 2, 4 in the morning. You're like, who voted for what? Right? Look at this guy. The other issue with some of these ballots is that in different counties in Florida, they had different ballots. And here in Palm Beach County, look at this ballot, right? Look at it. So if I wanted to vote for George Bush, easy, right? I'm going to punch right there. If I vote for Al Gore, the second one down, I should go, to the third one, right? That's a little bit confusing, right? Because first one is George Bush. Second one is the third one. If I punch the second one, that means that I'm voting for this guy, Pat Buchanan. What? Right? And so if we look at it from a different angle, you can see here, same ballot. If I were looking at this ballot, if I was looking at it from below, if I was a little shorter, right? It looks really like if I hit the second one, that I'm voting for Al Gore. And what ended up happening was that Pat Buchanan in this county got like an insane number of votes. Like he thought he was only going to get 1,000. He ends up getting like 4,000 votes. And even Pat Buchanan, he looked at the ballot and he was like, when I look at the ballot on election night, it's very easy for me to see how someone could have voted for me in the belief that they voted for Al Gore, right? So just from the ballots, just from the voting, kind of a mess, right? Hanging little pieces of paper, people punching in the wrong hole. So George Bush, he tries to sue Florida, the state of Florida, to stop them from counting the votes again. Florida's like, you know what? We're going to go ahead and count them again. So then George Bush and his lawyers, they're like, no, I won the election. We called it. Let's take this up to the Supreme Court. So Bush's lawyers, they failed to convince Florida. They take it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection to all, they say that the 14th Amendment, equal protection, that applies to voting as well. And they say that all votes have to be considered equally. And that means how we count the votes has to be equal across the board. And they say that you have to do that all by December 12th. Under federal law, all elections have to be decided by December 12th. It's kind of like the deadline, the voting deadline. So the Supreme Court says, because all of these different counties, because they all have their own individual problems, hanging chads, weird butterfly ballots, they say that there's no possible way that Florida could count these votes equally. Florida and Al Gore tried to argue that no, you can look to the intent of the voters, and they said that it'll be obvious when you look at the ballot. The Supreme Court said, no, we can't leave it up to judgment. The 14th Amendment says everyone has to be counted equally. There's no possible way to do that by December 12th. Therefore, the current winner should stand. So is it going to keep going? Oh, this is where it stops. So the current ruling should stand, and therefore Bush was declared the president by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, this is where it stops. And interesting to note, so the Supreme Court said, stop the recount. When Florida stopped the recount, Bush's lead over Al Gore was only 154 votes. 154! That's like, I don't know, that's like a street of neighbors voting, right? Like, that's not a lot of people. So, oh, there we go. The picture loaded. So Bush ends up being declared the president here on the basis of the 14th Amendment. All votes have to be counted equally. There's no way Florida could possibly count all of these equally or like change the rules or whatever by December 12th. Therefore, stop recounting. George Bush is the president. Some controversies as well surrounding the whole election. What's interesting is that if they went with what Al Gore said, which was just count the votes, look for intent, Bush probably would have won. And had they gone under George Bush's method, which is change everything, like reevaluate the methods, Al Gore would have won, right? So interesting to note that had the recount taken place, possibly we would have had a different president in the year 2000 up through 2008, right? So like 8 years of American history, possibly even more than that, could have been different based on really the Supreme Court and what they said. Another interesting thing, the governor of Florida, this very essential, crucial state, that's George Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, right there. Another interesting thing, Katherine Harris. She was very much a centerpiece of this whole thing. She was the Florida Secretary of State, and she was in charge of the election procedures, which, that's fine, but she was also George Bush's campaign chairwoman, right? So potential, maybe conflict of interest there. As well, on the Supreme Court, everyone voted along party lines. There are five Republicans, 4 Democrats on the Supreme Court. At that time there were, that's not always, but at that time, right? And everyone just voted along with their own kind of party ideology. One justice ended up, and his wife ended up working for President George Bush. One justice, the judge, he had two sons who worked for law firms that represented George Bush. So very, very messy, right? Not taking sides here, but it's a little messy, right? Not ideal. I sound like Jerry Seinfeld. There's the Supreme Court justices. There they are. These are the deciders, the law of the land. They get to interpret it. And so what are some of the effects here after this 2000 election, the year 2000? It's really not so far away. But for one, we begin to see the use of electronic voting machines, right? Where like paper seems too unreliable. We should do everything electronically. One problem though is there's no paper trail, right? Computers, electronics, the internet, it's very easy to manipulate and not have a paper trail or any form of proof as to who cast their vote for whom, right? We also begin to see some improvements and limits on how the news predicts the winner of an election, right? It used to be that the media would just kind of make a call and people were concerned that could influence elections. Now we see the media being a little bit more careful of making those calls, especially when, if you're CNN, as we saw in that clip, you made a call that one person's going to be president, and then just, a couple hours later, you're like, wait, a different guy is president, right? And so overall, kind of more broadly, people begin to question the validity or how reliable our voting system is, if we're counting paper ballots, if we're looking at little hanging pieces of paper, or if we're, punching a button on a computer, people begin to wonder, are people's voices really being counted in a way that is accountable? I don't know if that's a smart way to put it, but it sounds right. It sounds right. Okay, so those are our lecture notes. Head on over to the next thing. Keep on going. I believe in you. Yeah, signing off. Oh yeah, but also go vote. Obviously go vote. Like vote, because the election was so close. It was like 150 some votes. No, you vote. Make sure that like whoever you want to win, that they win by like a huge margin, right? Go vote. Tell everyone to vote. Bye.